Hi, I'm Simon Ligo. I'm an evolutionary ecologist at the University of New Orleans.
Hi, I'm Jerry Husak. I'm an evolutionary physiologist at the University of St. Thomas.
Welcome to Biology Exit Interviews, where we sit down with biologists who've had long and distinguished careers to talk about their science and about how biology has changed over the course of their working lives.
And whether you're brand new to integrative biology or you've been doing it for decades, I hope you'll join us and find something interesting in our stories. Thanks for joining us. All right, welcome to Biology Exit Interviews. Today, we're extremely happy to be sitting down and chatting with Rick Shine. Rick Shine is a professor at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia, and he's also an emeritus professor at the University of Sydney, where he spent 40 years as a faculty member at that institution. Rick joins us with, I would say a lot of papers, over 1,100 papers that have been collectively cited almost 100,000 times.
Rick has also published several books, including So Many Snakes, So Little Time, Snakes Without Borders, and most recently, Science in the Snake Pit. He's a fellow of the Australian Academy of Science. He's been awarded the Order of Australia and the Prime Minister's Prize for Science, to name only a few. And Rick has worked on an enormous number of questions in an enormous number of species, including recently a large body of work on the invasive cane toads in Australia. So welcome, Rick. Thanks very much for taking the time to sit down and talk to us.
It's a pleasure to have the opportunity.
So Rick, to give you some background, this whole project came about when Jerry and I met David Wake many years ago at a conference. And David told us about the beginning of his career, which for him involved having a job offer before he'd finished his PhD. Um, and then before he started his job at Berkeley, he already had funding from the National Science Foundation, which, just doesn't make any sense to anyone going into science today. So to start off with, maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you got started in science.
Look, primarily driven by an obsession with small, scaly creatures from childhood. I grew up in Eastern Australia, moving between some of the capital cities as my dad changed jobs, and I was always fascinated by reptiles and amphibians. I did science at high school. I basically flunked it, but I did very well in English, and my skills were probably always better in communication than they were in actually doing hardcore science, I fear. But it hasn't held me back too much. I did a science degree at the Australian National University in Canberra. Did an honours project. That's the fourth year of the undergraduate degree in the Australian system. Changing a bit now, but still quite common to do this honours degree, which is really just a research project. And I went to a small rural university called the University of New England for my PhD, basically because there was an American there called Hal Heatwole, who was the only human being that would supervise a student silly enough to want to work with snakes, which is what I really wanted to do. And so I did that from about 1972 through to 1976. And I guess in terms of the serendipitous way things work and the way that the world has changed, in those days, particularly at a small, fairly isolated university, we didn't have a seminar system or anything like that. And of course, it was long before the internet, so really pretty isolated. Nobody even thought about publishing their PhD before they'd submitted it, for assessment by the university. So you were essentially unemployable for some long period of time after you handed in the thesis, before you had a chance to grind out the papers. And so all the former graduate students were still living in Armidale, working as shop assistants and things like this, and hoping that eventually they would get some papers out and they could apply for an academic job. I was fortunate that an American called John Legler, a turtle taxonomy expert, came to the University of New England as a visiting scholar. He managed to wangle a, I think, 18-month long sabbatical somehow, John was a real wheeler and dealer. And he introduced me to some of the methods that enabled me to actually start gathering life history data on the snakes that I was studying. And he brought with him a brilliant PhD student called Jim Bull. Jim's currently in Idaho. He was at the University of Texas for many years. He's a fellow of the Academy in the US. And Jim and I hit it off, and we got really excited about evolutionary theory. We encountered George Williams' little book, Adaptation and Natural Selection, which opened our eyes to individual level selection and this just delightful mix of simplicity and complexity that's dominated my life ever since. So, I got the PhD done and I was pretty much dead in the water. And I was thinking I would never get a scientific job. I would probably have to go into some sort of government department and do bureaucratic things or whatever. But John Wigler had been sufficiently impressed by a particular project that Jim and I had done that he decided that he would wangle himself onto a selection committee back at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City that chose postdoctoral fellows. And he got one of his mates, Rick Charnoff, who was a brilliant young evolutionary mathematician and also a good mate of Jim's. And so he got Rick on the panel as well. So I think there were only 3 people on the panel. And despite a total lack of publications, I got a letter saying, would I like a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Utah? So, I have some guilt. There were probably some other terrific applicants, probably some women and people of color and whatever. I got the rails run, heterosexual white male, fairly good at sport. My life was easier than it could otherwise have been. But so that was the first huge chunk of luck. And so I went to Salt Lake City for a few years, had a great time, encountered an incredibly different way of doing science. In Australia, we knew so little about the ecology of the native fauna that basically everybody asked you, what species do you work on? Because, you would pick an unstudied species and you would work out its natural history. None of this sort of sophisticated ecological evolutionary question stuff. Whereas in Utah, it was all about, what's your hypothesis and so on. So they were really searching for a level of generality using maths and a whole bunch of techniques that I was unfamiliar with. But I had a great time, met a fantastic woman, managed to convince her to marry me, and 50 years later, we're still having a pretty good time together here in Australia. After 3 years, we came back to Australia, mostly because I was a bit homesick, and it's where I really wanted to live. And I don't know whether you want the gory details of the minutiae, but it was difficult to find a job. I was really, again, kind of feeling that I was going to have to go back to Australia without a job to go to and just apply for everything. It's a very small country academically, so there were very few positions to be had. And so you could wait a long time before a job came up in the right field. I actually got offered a postdoc in New Zealand working on lizards, and that was exciting and that was great. And then the New Zealand economy collapsed when the British pulled the plug on some of their economic support for the far-flung Antipodean colonies. And so the person in charge of it said, look, you can come, there's a salary, but there will be no expenses for any field work. There's no real possibility that you can do anything when you get here. You really should look for something else. And that was very honest and helpful advice. So I did, and I applied for a postdoc at the University of Sydney, which was Australia's oldest and one of the most prestigious universities. The day before we got on the plane to fly to Sydney, I got a letter saying, we're offering you a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Sydney, and we will pay your flights. So that I even got my flight reimbursed, probably not Terry's, but at least mine. I had a couple of years as a postdoc at the University of Sydney. I had learned a lot about publish or perish from the American system. I realized that in order to have a career in academia, I would need to be fairly prolific. And, I probably need to diversify my skills a bit. I did quite a bit of guest lecturing and so on in undergraduate courses. I was fairly certain by then that I had no career prospects and that I would end up again, in some job, some very applied job, maybe probably optimistic enough, some kind of a wildlife agency, government agency, or maybe a museum. But academia seemed very unlikely. And then, due to various political conflicts among academics within the University of Sydney, a couple of people left. I think one was a genuine retirement, but really they were both motivated by the fact that there was all sorts of workplace morale problems. And so there was a job came up at the same place that I was, with the people that I'd worked with for a couple of years that had got to know me. And somewhat to my astonishment, I think it was a couple of days before my 30th birthday, I suddenly had a lectureship in zoology, with a massive teaching load on things like human reproductive biology that I knew nothing about, to classes of, 150 first-year students. But it was a really valuable learning experience, and it all worked pretty well. I think from an American perspective, or at least a modern American perspective, one of the weirdest stories really is probably about getting tenure. I know it's a big deal and it's a huge battle. Back in the day at the University of Sydney, the rules said that if you performed okay, and that probably meant not disrobing in the corridor or whatever, that after 2 years you would be considered for tenure, and I think just about everybody would get it. But there was a possibility for accelerated tenure after 1 year if you were doing really, really well. And so my mentor was a guy called Charles Birch, a very influential pioneering ecologist who really championed ideas of stochastic, weather-driven fluctuations in animal ecology, as opposed to sort of the conventional competition-driven stable state ideas that were popular in Europe and North America. Anyway, so after I'd been around for about a year, I saw Charles in the corridor one day and I said, look, Charles, I've realized that there is a system at Sydney Uni where potentially I could get tenure now, immediately after a year, rather than waiting for a second year. Would that be possible? And Charles said, oh, look, I don't know. I've never heard of that. I'll check it out. And I saw him again in the corridor a week later. And he said, oh, Rick, good news. You've got tenure, mate. And that was it. And so I then stayed at Sydney, as you said, for 40 years. I worked my way through the academic system there. I had a conventional academic job, which in theory was, I think, 40% teaching, 40% research, and 10% administration. And of course, as happened everywhere in academia, the proportion of administration just started increasing. And the teaching started to change with financial pressures, fewer and fewer field courses, which were the bits that I really loved. But it was fine. It was great. It was a great job. And the remarkable aspect in retrospect was the lifestyle of an academic in the 1980s in Australia. And I don't know what it was really like in North America. Certainly in Utah, it was not like this. But I think perhaps reflecting the fact that we had a huge influx of English academics at the end of the Second World War as the Australian university system geared up to train returned soldiers and the like. The tea room had this phenomenal central role. And so at 10 o'clock every morning, the full-time employed tea ladies, a couple of Spanish ladies who made appalling tea, would make huge urns of tea, and the technical staff, research assistants and so on, would come in and they would have 15 minutes to have a cup of tea and chat. The university gave every academic a full-time research assistant. There was a lot of money around. And then after their 15 minutes, the technical staff would scurry out and the academic staff would march into the tea room, and we would then sit around and talk for at least half an hour about all kinds of abstruse stuff. Many issues, very scientific, many technical things. I remember there were a couple of people that were developing their own word processing program. I mean, these were the early days when, computers were a real novelty. And Folks thought they could do it better. So it's pretty difficult to imagine these days a biology academic sitting down and giving a year of their life to try and developing a word processor, but they were doing it and encountering a lot of problems and, how to get the page numbers put up in the top left-hand side of the page, not the top right. So, but it was a relaxed atmosphere, a lot of time for academic discussion. Um, all old folks look back on the golden days and so on, but there is no doubt that I think it was a very comfortable existence with less pressure than is currently the case. And that just eroded through time through a whole variety of processes where we saw the death of that kind of a university, the growth of a corporate model managed by accountants and with a whole different notion of universities as large businesses rather than as these little citadels of learning. So look, it was great to live in that world. I had a great time. The research flourished. Funding was primarily from a government body called the Australian Research Council. One of the differences between Australian and US culture is that we don't have a tradition of philanthropy and we don't have lots of alumni that give money. And so people are trying to change that. And there are some philanthropic organizations now, and they're starting to play an important role. But back in the day, it was the Australian Research Council, which gave out government grants, the equivalent of the NSF. They were always difficult to get, but not impossible. And so as a postdoc, the first year I applied, I got money. I believe it was $2,100, which was a princely sum and was enough for me to drive my car with my tent in it, off to the field site and live in the field for weeks. To do the things I needed to do. And so I have the unlikely distinction of having had ARC funding continuously throughout my entire career. I still have it, and I've never fallen off that particular gravy train. The amounts are somewhat larger now than they were at the beginning, but I think it's probably a reflection of the fact that I do publish prolifically in good journals, and that really is a primary criterion. And I like to write, and I like to write grant applications. And so I think that's probably one of my skills. I'm a hell of a lot better at that than I am at doing any kind of complex statistics, that's for sure.
Yeah.
So the funding came, and then I don't quite know why it happened, but these organizations, these government funding organizations, always go through bouts of self-reflection, and they come up with novel schemes, different ways to spend their money. And they came up, the ARC, the Australian Research Council, came up with this concept of senior fellowships, where you could buy a full professor out of their teaching load, enabling them to commit entirely to research for something like 5 years. And I sort of resisted it a little when it was first suggested. I mean, it was sort of an exciting idea, but I liked the teaching, and I had a feeling that if I took one of these fellowships, if I was able to get one, which was certainly not at all likely, because they were mostly going to the really eminent old folks, and I was still mid-career, I feared that I would be somewhat isolated from the rest of the department. I would be doing all the teaching, looking sideways at this guy that's sitting there having the luxury of doing research. But after a couple of years, the directions of satisfaction with the conventional academia were clearly not looking good. And I was really excited about what I might be able to achieve if I got the liberty of doing nothing but research. And so those 1,100 odd papers, I think it might be a bit more than that now. I think that they're mostly a reflection of the fact that for the second half of my academic career, I've been primarily employed as a researcher. I really haven't had these heavy teaching loads and major responsibilities in administration that most of my colleagues have had to deal with. And, it's remarkable that they got anything published. I spent a lot of my time hiding under the desk whenever somebody said who's going to be the next head of school. And I managed to avoid that. I've done a lot of committee work for the ARC, for the Academy of Science, for lots of other things. I was president of one of the big international herp societies a few years ago. You have to give back. I do a lot of reviewing and so on. But I really have had a charmed life as far as having the time and the resources, the financial resources from the ARC to concentrate on research. So I had a professorial fellowship and then a federation fellowship and then a laureate fellowship. They kept changing the name. Whenever the government would change after an election, they would change the name of the scheme, but the scheme would pretty much remain the same. But it meant you couldn't apply for two of these things, but because they kept changing the name, you could put in an application for the next incarnation. So that really carried me all the way through the latter part of my time at the University of Sydney. I decided that academia just wasn't quite so much fun anymore at that stage. And in 2018, I retired after 40 years. I spent 6 months traveling. I'd always wanted to go to Komodo Island to see the Komodos and places like that. And then I decided that what the hell, I still wanted to keep doing research. And so I contacted Macquarie University. It's a smaller, younger university here in Sydney. It's always been renowned for collegiality, for having a friendly, welcoming, in favor of diversity kind of a vibe, very big on mentoring and the like, and really a pretty good fit with a lot of the things that I think are important. And so to my delight, Macquarie took me on. I currently work there 2.5 days a week. And the research is probably going better than it ever has. The cane toad stuff is going in directions that I would never have expected. And to my astonishment, it's working out remarkably well. That's a very long answer to a very short question.
No, that's great because you actually answered already several questions that at least I had for you. So this is efficient. That's amazing. I did want to ask you about a couple of things that you brought up, and one of the things you mentioned was that sort of tea room culture. And I did my undergraduate honors and masters in South Africa in the late 90s, early 2000s. It was exactly the same, except that our tea time was at 11 a.m. and postgrads were actually expected to be at tea. Like if you didn't attend tea, it would be noticed and commented upon.
Yeah.
And I think it was like a really, really important part of the culture, just sort of like interacting with people and talking about science and not science. I'm kind of sad to hear you say that that's sort of gone away now. That's a shame.
Yes, I think it's died across the board. It certainly hung on longer at Macquarie than anywhere else I've been. And in fact, it was quite vibrant when I first got to Macquarie. But when COVID came
Mm.
and knocked everybody out of the university basically for a year, when we came back again, it was very hard to put that back together again. So there's still lots of conversations in corridors and still lots of chats and friendliness, but there isn't that kind of formal get together that used to be so central. It was pretty hierarchical. And at Sydney Uni in the early days, once a week, Charles Birch, the great eminence, Charles won a Templeton Prize for trying to reconcile Christianity with evolutionary biology. An interesting character. But Charles would have essentially high tea, ecology morning tea, it was known at, to which it was strictly invitation only. And most graduate students and junior faculty would not be invited. And Charles would hold forth on his latest ideas about what was happening to the planet and would interrogate the audience. And he would point at you and say, okay, here's the question. The question might be, how many tons of dog shit are deposited each year in New York City? And you were meant to answer preferably accurately, but if you couldn't do that, at least with some humor. And so Charles didn't really understand humor, but the other people in the room did, and he was prepared to go along with it. So it was extraordinarily intellectual. I mean, it was about examining the structure of arguments and logic and evidence and how would you work out whether or not that proposition is the case. It seems very old worldly now in the days of fake news. And the two-sentence summary of stuff. It was detailed, analytical detective work about ideas, and because we didn't feel under time pressure, it was very easy to spend half an hour chatting with somebody about the sex lives of dragonflies, um, uh, about their research or about something that they'd read.
Yeah, you brought up some good points about kind of the different culture of the younger generation and kind of the up and coming scientists. Do you feel like that's something they even desire at this point to have that kind of tea room time and just slowing down and talking about ideas in a really deep and meaningful way, or are we past that at this point, do you think?
I think there's a hell of a diversity out there. I still do quite a bit of field work. And if I'm out at Daly Waters in the centre of the Northern Territory and there's a monsoonal rain going on, and I'm sitting in a room unable to get out into the field, and I've got a couple of postdocs and a grad student with me, we have those same kinds of conversations. And those people are very smart, very coherent in their arguments, and so on. The passion is still there, but the broad culture has moved on. I mean, I think in a sense, the isolation meant that we had to talk to each other. It's like living in a small town. I really notice it. When I'm, again, living up in the Northern Territory, as I have for long periods, the only people you have to talk to are the guys that work at the buffalo farm. There's two or three other scientists, and there's half a dozen blokes from the buff farm, and there's the secretary, and a couple of other people, and her husband, and you spend a lot of time talking to them, and you get to know them, and it gets quite deep. Whereas in a world with Facebook and everything on your phone, you can contact somebody who is incredibly like-minded that lives on the other side of the world and have a chat with them. And so the ability to instantly reach out and contact the easy people to talk to, as opposed to the people that you're in the office next door to you, is incredibly alluring. And I think that's really eroded a lot of the tea room culture.
Do you think that's also had an impact on collaborations over the years? Because I know you've worked with many people over your career, and the way that you can interact with collaborators is probably very different now than it was, say, 30, 40 years ago. Do you think that's had an impact on how you've done science over that time?
Yeah, look, I think that the growth of the internet had far more effect on those of us in Australia than it did people who were in the centres of power in Europe and North America. I mean, you guys already had people you could talk to, and you could drive for a day and get to a conference and things like that. We were really isolated. I mean, if I sent a manuscript off to a journal, it went by snail mail. It'd take a week and a half to get there. It'd take a week and a half to get back. Everything was slow, and we were very, very isolated. So the ability to have a Zoom chat like this with people on the other side of the world is just extraordinary. And my older son is an academic in neurobiology, and he has this incredible international set of interactions. I mean, he just every day is spending his time talking to people all over the planet in real time, developing collaborations and working together in a way that was just absolutely inconceivable early in my career. So, I'm a bit of a dinosaur. I've probably resisted some of the opportunities that are there, but there is no doubt that I have benefited enormously from the collaborations with people from all over the world. And it's been an enormous joy and a privilege.
So you mentioned the fellowships that you had and how they kept changing, which was sort of I noticed that as well. When I was in Australia very briefly, I had an Australian postdoctoral fellowship, which I don't even know if that exists anymore. Um, but so you said you got to buy yourself out of teaching, and I knew some people who had those, but they would still teach sometimes, even though they didn't have to, which at the time as a postdoc I didn't really understand. Did you did you feel like you missed teaching at all, or were you just happy to be able to devote yourself 100% to research?
I really missed the teaching that I had done in the early days when we had relatively small classes, and you could literally walk into a lecture theatre and pick up a piece of chalk and, pose a question to the students, you know, and it could be something that would now be very politically unacceptable. Do you think the average IQ is different from a suburb in the rich part of Sydney to the poor part of Sydney? And get a conversation going and get people, and eventually get to notions of complex genetic, environmental, and G times E interactions driving traits and things like that. But it was a whole different style of teaching, and it became very codified. You had to have learning objectives. You had to have the PowerPoint and much more constrained. And I enjoyed that less. I think in my own case, what happened was that after a period of some frustration, when I sort of missed teaching, I got pushed into a lot more public outreach and media. As soon as I started working with cane toads, I mean, the rotten things invaded a study site where I've been working on snakes for 20 years. Snakes were my first love. It became clear that this was an unparalleled opportunity to find out what an invasive species does and what we could do about it. And so, with some enthusiasm, I became a cane toad biologist as well as a snake biologist. It gave us access to a lot more resources because Australians hate cane toads and government wants to keep people happy, so they were happy to give money towards cane toads. But it also meant that I was confronted with an enormous appetite from the media, from radio, TV, documentary filmmakers, whatever, to talk about the work and to give talks. I gave a talk yesterday down at some men's club in the middle of Sydney. Extraordinary. So I do a lot of that. And that really, I think, kind of scratches that itch for the desire to teach. I see it as exactly the same as teaching. I'm reaching a much wider audience. I have to pitch it a bit differently, and you don't get quite as long to tell the story. But there is still an opportunity there to help people grapple with evidence-based approaches to doing something about the biodiversity crises that are gripping the planet. And that's just, such a wonderful thing to be able to do that I don't miss, walking out and talking about human reproductive biology in front of the first years anymore.
And probably in some ways it has a much bigger impact in the broader scheme of things too, with those kinds of outreach opportunities.
Look, I really hope that's true. Certainly the audience is huge and you do reach the people that make decisions. We've certainly had cases where it seems to have been very effective in terms of its conservation impact. So, for example, with the cane toads, one of the first discoveries we made when the toads arrived was that their impact on native wildlife was extremely patchy. The big predators were being killed. They were fatally poisoned when they ate a large cane toad because of the distinctive poisons that the toads contain, which give any predator that tries to eat a big toad a heart attack. And so we got this 90% mortality of goannas, crocodiles, quolls, some of the big snakes, blue-tongued skinks. But most of the small predators were unaffected, and the reason turned out to be that the toads that they tried to eat were small and had very little poison, and so rather than dying of a heart attack, the predator would get very sick and it would learn not to eat toads. So that even if it was big enough to eat a big toad, when it encountered a big toad, it would turn it down. It wouldn't try to eat it. And so I had the idea that the problem is that the toad invasion is dominated by very large toads because they move much quicker than small toads. And they don't breed, the females full of eggs are left behind. And so if you're a goanna at the invasion front, the first toad you meet's a big one, you try to eat it, you die of a heart attack. I had the idea that if we just dumped a few thousand baby toads in advance of the front so that the first toad you met was a small one, we could give the predators a chance to learn. And they would then survive when the toad front arrived because when they met a big toad, they would recognize this was the kind of thing that makes you really sick. Now, if that worked and those predators are still alive in a couple of years' time, the toads keep arriving, the toads start breeding, there's baby toads everywhere, and so the offspring of those predators grow up in a world where they can learn for themselves. So we only have to do it once. So if that worked, it would be a very innovative conservation method that might keep apex predators in the system. The problem is, of course, that it sounds ludicrously stupid. This academic wants to release thousands of baby toads in advance of the cane toad front. And there's all these community groups that are going out every night catching toads and killing them in order to stop the invasion. And for an academic to come along and say, let's release more of the little darlings in advance of the front, the newspaper headlines in Darwin especially were just hilarious, just wonderful. You know, what planet does this guy come from, and so on. So we did the preliminary stuff with radio track quolls. We taught half of them not to eat toads, not the other half. The ones we taught survived, the other guys died. We did it with blue tongues, we did it with crocodiles, we did it with goannas, working very closely with Indigenous communities, Aboriginal Australians. And we built this major social consensus that it wasn't such a stupid idea. You know, whenever I got an award, like the Prime Minister's Prize for Science, we would emphasise the fact that the teacher toad idea was really my big contribution. And so it got lots and lots of air. And so I finally talked the Western Australian State Government Department into deploying this at a landscape scale, expecting there might be a few screams of outrage from the old warriors, and nobody said a word. I never saw a critical word. And so we've released 250,000 baby cane toads in advance of the front. And in the places we have done that, the goannas and the crocodiles have survived. In the places we haven't done it, they've died. So I think it's true that if you put your effort into public education, you can sway approaches to conservation. I'm currently with the cane toads. I'm deeply involved in a project that uses CRISPR-Cas9 to genetically manipulate toads, and that's a real minefield. Many members of the public are terrified about transgenic organisms. What we're doing is just gene knockouts. They're not transgenic. They don't have those risks, but that takes an education campaign. So far, I think it's going pretty well, but it's a challenge. And without public education, you're never going to get the people with you, and you're never going to be able to achieve these things unless the public is on your side and understands what it is you're trying to do.
That's amazing. That's that's really clever, actually. I wonder if, since you talked about how every time there's a new government, the structure of the ARC changed. Did the structure of research funding in Australia shape the types of questions that you were able to pursue? And did that change over time? You just mentioned, like, some ideas are more popular than others. Have you found that you've been getting support for different things over the course of your career, or has it always been same?
I'm a particularly stubborn human being, I think, fairly dedicated to the idea that life is not a dress rehearsal and that you only get the one chance to do it. And I am passionate about the idea that you shouldn't let the availability of funding in a particular direction drive you into doing your research on that topic. So just because your political masters think that they would love to see a bunch of money spent on that doesn't necessarily mean that I want to apply for that money and change what I'm doing. So that I have tried desperately to do the research that I found the most interesting and that I thought was the most valuable and worth doing. Sometimes that's been politically popular. Sometimes it's a bit less popular, and it's harder to find the cash. But I think there's a real principle there in trying to do the stuff that you're good at, that you're excited about, that you think is worth doing. I also think you probably do a much better job if you're genuinely excited about it. So I see a lot of people in applied research institutions that work hard, but they're basically trying to solve a problem that somebody else thinks it's worth solving. And many of those people end up, I think, with less fulfillment from what they're doing than the curiosity-driven stuff. So, I'll wave the flag in the air and say that history says that curiosity-driven research can be incredibly productive because you have the passion of the people that are doing it.
I also wanted to ask you, I have a sort of a slightly left field question here. So one of my favorite books is Last Chance to See by Douglas Adams. And right at the beginning of the book, he has a meeting with this dude who Adams describes him as a man in Melbourne who probably knows more about poisonous snakes than anyone else on earth. So this is back in the day, right? And his name was Dr. Struan Sutherland. Did you know him? Did you know anything about Struan Sutherland?
Yeah, look, I met him several times. He was one of these interesting characters that straddles the divide between medicine and science. His training was in medicine. He didn't actually wear a top hat, but his mode of dress otherwise was pretty much, you wouldn't have been surprised to see a top hat on Struan. Um, yeah, look at an interesting, rather, larger than life character. Um, I think the passion was there. I don't think his forte was in science. I mean, he saw snakebite as a medical issue, but he was prepared to go out there and talk to snake people about it. Um, he gave a wonderful talk at a conference that I was at where he described his greatest discovery, which was the pressure bandage technique for snakebite in Australia. People really had struggled. Antivenoms work, but it's hard to get people to it and so on. And Struan basically discovered that a nice firmly applied pressure bandage would keep the venom close to the bite site because it actually gets back into the systemic circulation through the very superficial lymphatic um, vessels rather than through the veins and so on. And it was purely by accident. He was doing an inflated splint on a monkey late one afternoon, and the damn splint got a leak. And he thought, "Damn, we're going to kill the monkey." What a waste. And so he just there was a bandage sitting there, and so he just sort of slammed it on the monkey's leg, and went home muttering. And then he came back in the next morning, and the monkey was bright and hale and healthy. And that was really the breakthrough. So anyone that's prepared to tell the story about the serendipitous way that he made his life's greatest discovery, I think deserves a bit of respect.
Did you have a chance to work with any other big name visiting scientists over the course of your time doing field work in Australia? People who may have come over from the US or elsewhere and wanted to work where you were doing your research?
Oh yeah, look, over the years, I mean, people do come through Sydney. I mean, I met a few obviously when I was in Salt Lake City as well. Bill Hamilton, George Williams, and crowd. Steve Gould came over, spent a little bit of time with him. I don't know that, I mean, people often ask about mentors and inspiration and things like that. And I think for me, the inspiration has mostly come from two sources. One is the study organisms that I find this endless fascination in the evolutionary play within the ecological theatre. And the other source are my students, who are just, in many cases, phenomenal people. And so, yeah, look, I think I've had this kind of reverse inspirational models from younger people more often than from the grand eminences.
No, that's cool. Do you think that that's changed at all, or is it just too variable that that folks still see the inspiration from the study organisms, or has our educational system somehow kind of beaten it out of people and they're forced to focus on other things to inspire them?
I think it's true that in mainstream academia, and it varies, I think, among institutions and fields, but there's definitely, natural history became a dirty word a long time ago. And there was a real attempt there with the rise of the comparative method and so on. I remember Paul Harvey wandering around saying, "We have enough data, the age of dirty boots biology is over." And it's simply not true. And it's especially not true in a place like Australia, but I think it's probably not true anywhere. We still need people out there looking at real organisms. Um, but yeah, look, there's no doubt that if I was writing a grant proposal or giving a talk in an academic context, I wouldn't get up and jump up and down and say, "Wow, I think red-bellied black snakes are really cute and they make me feel good." I mean, that's not the selling point. That's not the way you would frame a grant application. Um, on the other hand, if I went down to the local, reptile keepers society, I could probably get away with doing that. And indeed, I do it quite frequently and really enjoy mixing with people who have this just unabashed adoration for these animals. That animals don't share that adoration. They'd quite like to kill you probably, but people feel it very strongly. So yeah, but you dress up what you do in the context of what group you're trying to talk to. So I'm excited by ideas. I think our discovery of spatial sorting in the context of the toad invasion was far and away the greatest conceptual advance that I've ever been involved with, and I prize it enormously. It's a hard idea to explain to anyone, but I think it's really important. Um, but it's a different kind of an allure than you get from seeing the glossy scales of a water python shimmering in the sunlight.
Your brother is also an enormously successful biologist, and he won many of the same awards in Australia. So, what is the heritability of whatever it is that makes you a great scientist in Australia? What do you and your brother have in common that makes you both so successful?
Yeah, look, it's an enormous puzzle to me. Um, my brother looks very much like me. He's 4 years older. Um, and yeah, I mean, he has had a very eminent scientific career. He cloned the first human gene, growth hormone. He was president of the Academy of Science. He and I both won awards from the Academy. He and I both won the Prime Minister's Prize for Science. The only brothers that have ever got that, and probably the only ones that ever will. Um, it's hard to know. I mean, our brains probably work in similar ways in some respects. I think it's interesting that my older son is also a scientist and doing research in science. Um, yeah, look, there's nothing in the Shine family heritage. You know, there was no one had ever been to university. My mum had to leave partway through high school because there wasn't enough money to put girls through school. Um, Dad never went to university. You know, he was ended up in a prisoner of war camp in Germany during the Second World War, and I think never really recovered from the stress of that later in life. So no, look, it is just one of these bizarre things. So as I get older and John gets older, and as our colleagues in the Academy of Science get older, I'm now used to the fact that every time I go to an Academy of Sciences meeting, people call me John and they call him Rick. So there's no doubt that we do look similar. We've got objective evidence on that. And I guess our brains must work in similar ways, but I have no idea why that is the case.
And no pressure for your son to make it, the trifecta here of father, son getting all these prizes too.
No, my sons have gone their own directions. They're both very successful in their fields and bless their hearts.
So you've had many, many, many publications, well over 1,100, at or more than 100,000 citations, just an incredible impact in the literature. Um, so thinking back to all those papers that you've published over the years, what's your favorite one that you feel like just didn't get the love that you thought it should have?
Yeah, look, I mentioned spatial sorting. I think we had a paper in preceding National Academy of Science. It's got lots of citations and people are using it, but I think it will eventually be realized as a really important paper. I think people are used to a world in which natural selection is the only mechanism that generates novel phenotypes. And the news, guys, is that there's actually two mechanisms. And spatial sorting in some ways is even simpler, and it can create these remarkably different phenotypes that are incredibly functional very, very quickly. And it can interact with natural selection in important ways. So, yeah, look, I was sort of hoping that, the world would stop spinning on its axis and everyone would scream with joy when the spatial sorting paper came out. And that didn't really happen. But lots of people are using the idea, and it'll eventually take its place there. Um, I don't know. It's difficult to predict at the time what papers will catch the fancy of the audience out there, and which will be cited and which will keep being cited. My most highly cited paper is a thing on ecological causes for sexual dimorphism, which was a big literature review, which was a big deal back in the day before the internet. And a whole bunch of librarians probably went to early graves because of the stress that I put them through trying to track down papers about obscure rotifers and so on. But I actually was working on that paper, and then I ran out of time. I had to go on a big field trip up to the Northern Territory for a couple of months. And when I got back, I discovered that I'd had all sorts of ideas about how I was going to finish that paper and all the conclusions I was going to bring together conceptually, and I couldn't remember any of them because I just had 2 months out there in the tropical sun. And so I thought, oh, bugger it, I'll just basically add a final paragraph and send it off. And that has ended up being, as I said, incredibly highly cited. So it's a bit hard to pick the good stuff. I think I'd probably need longer to think about that. But look, broadly, I'm delighted that folks do read some of it and they cite it, and yeah.
So you mentioned earlier that you really enjoyed the process of writing. Does that account for how incredibly prolific you are? Like 1,100 papers and all of your books. Like, how do you find the time? Like, you have to love it, right? You have to love sitting down and putting one word after the other.
Yeah, look, I do. I really enjoy the writing process. It's probably the most unusual aspect for me. I think I've had 50 PhD students, and I've probably had half a dozen that genuinely enjoy writing. But there seems to be something about the people that go into at least my field where they're often really good at asking questions, at gathering the data to answer those questions, and so on, analyzing the data. But when it comes time to telling the story, that just doesn't resonate with them, and they really struggle. So it's we're all good at different things. If you try to get me to use R, the statistical language, I mean, it's just embarrassing. I can't do it, and I refuse to learn. And so I can't get too precious about people that don't find writing to be enjoyable. Yeah, look, it's just one of those things, different chunks of your brain, and some people enjoy doing that, and some people enjoy doing this. It's sort of like getting thrills out of looking at a snake versus a model train set. We're different.
Yeah, definitely. I find that one of the biggest challenges of mentoring students is teaching them how to write. Um, like you said, very few people are very good at it, and then most people not so much. Have you noticed after all the time, all these students that you've mentored, do you find that students are getting worse at writing over time, or they've just been sort of equally as bad at it forever?
I don't know that I have the sample size to pick really strong trends through time. There was a time when the American students that came to do their PhDs with me were clearly vastly more articulate in spoken presentations than the Australians, but much worse at written communication. That
Mhm.
was a really strong pattern, but it broke down, I think, through time. But that's about the only really clear pattern that I would see. And to be fair to the modern students, I probably don't see what they're writing on social media and so on. Some of them may well have incredible aptitude with using visuals and words in ways that may not perhaps resonate with a geriatric old professor, but might resonate really well with the audience that they're working for. So I think, there are some probably very good communicators. Well, there definitely are some very good communicators out there, maybe trying to get their message across in different media with different constraints. I probably wouldn't be as good at some of those things as they are. I think my forte is probably the relatively short, relatively informal, um, telling a story about why something biological is interesting.
So I'm kind of curious what you would offer as advice for an early career researcher to be successful. You knew it was coming, probably.
I always preface any advice with the notion that it may be so outdated that it's useless. I have a lot of smart young people who truly believe that investing a lot of their energy into their social media profile and so forth is really a productive way to advance their careers. They may be right. I have seen no evidence that they are right. And in the context where I can evaluate it, it really hasn't been a big factor in the decisions of committees to hand out money or promotions or jobs and so on. So, oh, look, I guess I'm just the classic example of the follow the dream thing. I have been incredibly fortunate to have had the opportunity to spend my professional career asking the sorts of questions that most fascinate me about the organisms that most interest me. That's an incredible luxury. If I had been born in many other parts of the world, or a different gender, or a different lifestyle, or whatever, differential ability, I could never have done that. So I'm very, very fortunate. That's worked for me, and I guess my advice is to give it a try. Try to do the stuff that you think is worth doing and that you think you're pretty good at doing. Try to find that, search widely. I think, otherwise it rapidly gets into cliches about, treat the people you're working with respect and that kind of thing. Do it honestly. But look, I don't think I have any recipe. It's every life's different, and I just feel incredibly fortunate to have had the opportunities that I've been given.
All right. Thank you so much for your time, Rick. We really,
Oh,
really
good.
appreciate it. This has been really fun.
It's been fun to dwell on some of these broader issues. It's great.